there's a gene in your body that shouldn't exist. It appeared about 10 million years ago, in an ancestor you never met, and it's the entire reason you can drink alcohol without dying. Nobody planned it. It was an accident. That turned into one of the biggest habits our species has ever had. Let's start with the obvious question. What actually is alcohol, biologically speaking? It's not something humans invented from scratch. It's a waste product. When yeast, a microscopic fungus that exists basically everywhere, breaks down sugar for energy, it produces two byproducts, carbon dioxide and ethanol, alcohol. Yeast isn't making alcohol for you. It's making alcohol because that's just what happens when it eats sugar without oxygen around. You are, every time you have a drink, consuming fungus exhaust. Romantic, I know. And this process, fermentation, doesn't need a brewery. It doesn't need a human. It happens naturally, constantly, anywhere sugary fruit sits around long enough to rot. Overripe fruit on a forest floor is basically a tiny natural distillery. Wild yeast lands on it, starts breaking down the sugar, and within days that fruit can contain a meaningful amount of alcohol. This has been happening for tens of millions of years, long before anything resembling a human existed, to appreciate it. Transitional beat before the gene reveal. Which brings us to the gene. In 2014, a team of researchers led by Matthew Kerrigan studied an enzyme called ADH4, which is responsible for breaking down ethanol in your digestive tract. They traced its evolutionary history back through the primate family tree, and found something remarkable. About 10 million years ago, a single mutation appeared in the ancestor shared by humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas. One tiny genetic change. And that change made the ADH4 enzyme roughly 40 times more efficient at metabolizing alcohol than the version our more distant primate relatives still carry. Transitional beat, closing the gene, reveal section, 40 times. Not a small tweak, a massive upgrade, appearing at almost exactly the moment our ancestors were shifting from living mostly in trees to spending more time on the forest floor, where fallen, overripe, fermenting fruit would have been a normal part of the diet. This is the basis of what researchers call the drunken monkey hypothesis, proposed by biologist Robert Dudley. The idea isn't that our ancestors were seeking out a buzz, it's that alcohol, in small natural doses, was an honest signal. A strong smell of fermentation meant ripe, sugar-rich, calorie-dense fruit nearby, exactly what a hungry primate needed to find. The ancestors who could process that alcohol without getting dangerously impaired, who could eat the fermenting fruit and keep functioning, had a real survival advantage. They found more food, they got sick less often, and they passed that efficient enzyme down the line, generation after generation, long before anyone had a word for alcohol, let alone a reason to make it on purpose. Bridging to the ancient and baked-in thesis. Modern figure appearing at timeline's end, before the strange part to sit with. Thesis statement. So, here's the strange part to sit with. Your ability to drink alcohol isn't a modern convenience, layered on top of your biology. It's ancient. It's baked in, millions of years before agriculture, before pottery, before anything you'd recognize as civilization. Your ancestors were already chemically equipped for this exact substance, because natural selection had already solved the problem for them. Bridging into the animal comparison section. And humans aren't even the only animal this happened to. Elephants have been documented deliberately seeking out fermented marula fruit. Elephant eating. Certain birds, including cedar waxwings, have been found visibly intoxicated after eating fermented berries, occasionally flying into windows, because their coordination gave out. Tree shrews in Malaysia regularly drink naturally fermented nectar, with an alcohol content comparable to beer, as part of their completely normal diet, seemingly without issue. The pattern shows up again and again across the animal kingdom, wherever sugar, yeast, and thyme overlap. Alcohol tolerance isn't a uniquely human quirk. It's an old recurring evolutionary answer to an old recurring chemical accident. Now, knowing how to handle accidental alcohol and deliberately making it are two very different things. And the archaeological record for that second part is genuinely fascinating. The oldest confirmed evidence of intentional fermentation comes from Raqefet Cave in Israel, dating back roughly 13,000 years to a culture called the Natufians. Archaeologists found stone mortars there, with residue consistent with a beer, like fermented gruel, made from wild grains, brewed in a cave used for burials and ritual gatherings. This is thousands of years before anyone had domesticated wheat or barley as a farmed crop. These were still hunter-gatherers, and they were already fermenting wild grain into something you could drink. Closing the Raqefet section. That timing matters enormously, because it feeds into one of the more controversial ideas in the history of agriculture. It's called the beer before bread hypothesis. Proposed by researchers including Solomon Katz, the traditional story of farming is straightforward. Humans domesticated grain to make bread, and beer came later, almost as a byproduct. The beer before bread hypothesis flips that order. It suggests that the desire for a reliable supply of fermented grain, something valuable enough for ritual, for status, for pulling a community together, might have been one of the actual motivations that pushed hunter-gatherers toward the difficult labor-intensive work of cultivating grain in the first place. Not survival alone, alcohol. Transitional beat, closing the hypothesis introduction. Eat toward the caveat paragraph. To be clear, this is a genuinely debated hypothesis, not settled fact. Bread and porridge were obviously important too, and most archaeologists think grain domestication had multiple overlapping motivations, rather than one single cause. But the Raqefet Cave findings, brewing before farming existed, are hard evidence that fermentation wasn't a late invention, tacked onto agriculture. If anything, it might have helped inspire it. Bridging to Jiahu. Further evidence comes from Jiahu, a Neolithic site in China, dating to roughly 9,000 years ago. Chemist Patrick McGovern analyzed pottery residue found there, and identified traces of fermented beverages, made from rice, honey, and fruit. One of the oldest chemically confirmed alcoholic drinks ever found. This wasn't a fluke. Wherever early humans had sugar, water, and time, they seem to have arrived at fermentation again and again, independently, across completely disconnected parts of the world. Grapes in the Caucasus, rice in China, grain in the Fertile Crescent, agave, much later, in Mesoamerica. Different ingredients, same basic chemistry, discovered over and over by people who had never met each other, and never would. And once humans figured out they could deliberately trigger this process, instead of waiting to stumble across rotting fruit, alcohol stopped being an accident and became a tool. A tool for celebration, for ritual, for sealing agreements, for getting an entire group of exhausted people to relax together after a hard season. Shared fermented drink shows up again and again at burial sites, feast sites, gathering places. The same pattern this channel has traced with other substances. Something biologically accidental, discovered independently across cultures. That ended up doing real social work, binding groups together in ways that mattered for survival, just as much as calories did. A shared cup passed around a fire works on the same basic principle as a shared ritual smoke circle. It synchronizes a group, lowers guardedness, and creates a kind of manufactured trust that would otherwise take far longer to build. That's not a coincidence. Groups that could bond quickly and reliably had a real edge. And it turns out, a fermented drink was a remarkably efficient shortcut to getting there. So, how did humans discover alcohol for the first time? The honest answer is that we didn't, not really. Not as a single moment. The discovery happened in slow motion, over millions of years, starting with a gene mutation nobody chose, and a habit of eating fermented fruit off a forest floor. By the time anyone was intentionally brewing anything in a cave in the Levant 13,000 years ago, the real discovery, the biological one, had already been made millions of years earlier, quietly by ancestors who had no idea. They were setting up one of the oldest habits their descendants would ever share. Next time you have a drink, you're not doing something new. You're running a program that's been installed in your body, since long before there were bodies that looked anything like yours. The yeast hasn't changed its process in millions of years, and it never will. It's still doing exactly what it did on that forest floor 10 million years ago, quietly turning sugar into alcohol, with no awareness that anyone is even paying attention. Your ancestors just got better and better at noticing what it was doing, and eventually, at doing it on purpose.